You're a woman in the 20th century. You're sick of your controlling husband and have decided that you're going to stand up to him. You confront him and, of course, he doesn't like it, and the conversation soon turns into a yelling match. So he decides to send you to the doctors to get you fixed. You're out of control, he says. They propose a simple procedure, a lobotomy, to make you normal again. They're going to pick and prod inside your head, slicing a part of your brain open to make you, quote unquote, happier. You don't want to go through with it, obviously, but what can you do? You're just a woman, a hysteric one, at that. The doctor said so. You plead with your husband to tell the doctors that you're not crazy, that you don't need this procedure, but he doesn't seem to agree with you. So now you're completely helpless as you lay on the operating table, praying that these doctors don't completely scramble up your head. You begin to count down as the doctors stand over you, holding up their ice pick-like instruments. Hi, this is Wenshu, and today I'll be talking about the silencing of women in history through poor psychiatric care and diagnoses. The scenario you just heard was the reality, with varying details in circumstance, for thousands of lobotomized women in the 1900s. Lobotomies were procedures where a physician guided a long cannula, the original lobotomist first used an ice pick, through the patient's eye socket and into the brain, and then moved it left to right to sever the patient's lower frontal lobe. These were normally performed on women to make them more normal and compliant. In the 50,000 patients that underwent this surgery in the US and Canada, about 70% were women. All of the women with successful procedures were described to be somewhat of a shell of what they once were. Bright and passionate women were stripped of their personhood, leaving them with only their skills to make meals and pack the children's lunches, according to one man interviewed on his wife's lobotomy. They were calm and cooperative, but seemingly lacked the emotions and intelligence that made them human. In the past, women who didn't conform to society's take on femininity were usually faced with one of two things, a lobotomy being one of them, a prolonged stay in the psychiatric ward the other. Both horrific forms of psychiatric treatment deemed acceptable in the 19th to 20th century. The biggest reason that women were declared insane was hysteria. The term was often used to describe emotionally charged behavior that seems excessive and out of control, but it was an incredibly loosely used diagnosis. If a woman was unmarried by the age of 40, she'd be deemed hysteric. If she had an interest in reading or writing, off to the doctor she'd go. There was no real set of guidelines when diagnosing a woman with hysteria, and doctors would write off women as hysterical for a seemingly infinite list of reasons. Researchers of medical history now have proven that hysteria was little more than a way to describe everything a man found mysterious or unmanageable in women, and then lock them up for it. The proposal of the illness itself traces back to the 2nd millennium BC, about 4,000 years ago, but the actual term gained popularity in the 18th century, and thousands of women were diagnosed with it all the way up until the late 1900s. Regarded as an expert in his field, French physician Joseph Rollin believed that women were more predisposed to this ailment because of their quote-unquote lazy and irritable nature, which is why it's often referred to as female hysteria. Because of how often a woman was proclaimed insane in the past, even though she at many times was completely fine, it won't shock you to hear that most women put in psychiatric wards during the 20th century were actually totally sane. Elizabeth Packard was an example of this. A housewife in the mid-1800s stood up to her domineering husband and very quickly was sent packing to an asylum in Illinois for defying domestic control. Husbands needed no real justification for sending their wives away during this time, and they could get them locked up by their request, no questions asked. According to a historically accurate list of reasons for admission for women, greediness, jealousy, involvement in politics, and strong religious beliefs were also reasons that women could be placed in these wards. Back then, people believed that women that weren't normal, in the sense that they weren't the standard docile housewife, were sick or should be locked away until they learned to be more female. Women in this age were more or less taught to either be a good girl or be locked up. Then there's the topic of truly mentally ill women. Because society didn't want to acknowledge those who truly needed and deserved help, horrific treatment and procedures were used to silence them. Psychology and modern medicine have obviously come a long way, but it's incredibly important to recognize the awful past of medicine so that we're reminded of the bias and prejudice that also exists among medical practitioners in our time. For example, a 2018 review shows that medical professionals are more likely to dismiss women patients as too sensitive, hysterical, or as time wasters. Every demographic should be allowed appropriate and unbiased healthcare, but countless studies show that this just hasn't been achieved yet because of how deeply rooted these ideas are. In the words of Andrea Tone and Mary Koziol at McGill University, what will historians of the future say about our present? Are we undertreating women's pain because we categorize women as emotive? Psychology has failed women time and time again in the past. So to move modern medicine forward and prevent history from repeating itself, we must understand the historical context in which this bias stems from. We must fight for gender equality in the medicinal world, and that starts with learning our history.